So thanks for joining. Um, my name is Kenneth Baidoo, and today we are talking about how to build a practical third-party risk management program from scratch. So this isn't theory, it's the process I use day to day. So let's get into it. So before we start, a couple of quick housekeeping notes. Your mic and cameras are all muted, so drop any questions into the chat as we go, and we will get to them in the Q&A. So this session is being recorded too, so you'll get a link afterward if you want to revisit anytime. A quick word about me. I'm a compliance risk analyst in information security and GRC at the Philadelphia International Airport, where I work across governance, risk, and compliance, including third-party risk. I hold the ISACA CRISC certification. I'm also a Security Plus certified, and I also run KB Cyber on the side. So these talks come from what I actually do, not what I've read in the past. So here's what we are headed today. We will start with why third-party risk matters, then walk through the life cycle for managing it. After that, we'll get into assessing and treating vendor risk. And I'll walk you through a real case study. And we'll wrap up with key takeaways and also leave time for questions. By the end of this session, I want you walking away with three things. The first one on the list, a clear sense of why vendor risk is your risk. Second, a repeatable life cycle you can actually implement. And thirdly, the judgment to look at real vendor evidence and make a call on it. So let's start with why this matters. So every vendor you bring to your organization extends your attack surface, right? And you don't control their environment the way you control your own. If they get breached, that's your incident too. So regulators know this now, and which is why they are holding organizations accountable for vendor failures. And a structured program is what turns that risk into something you can actually manage and show evidence for. So what does a strong program actually look like? Looking at the third-party risk management lifecycle. So I'll drill it down to four things. The first on the list is governance. So there's clear ownership of these decisions. And we move on to the risk-based assessment. So you are not spending the same effort on every vendor. Then you move on to due diligence, meaning you are verifying claims with evidence, not just taking them, at face value, and monitoring because risk doesn't stop the day a vendor gets approved. Monitoring is one of the key areas I see people ignore in third-party risk management programs. Once they approve a vendor, that is it. They let it slide. They don't track. There's no system to track the risk if any triggers a reassessment for that. So monitoring the last stage and the fourth stage for a third-party risk management program is very essential. So here is the life cycle I use. There are 7 stages, right? So the first stage starts with the intake. So then you move to the tiering based on risk, then assessment, then treatment of whatever we find. So once that's resolved, we move to approval, then continuous monitoring, and eventually offboarding when relationships end. I'll walk through each of these stages in more detail, but this is the shape of the whole process from intake to tiering to assessment to treatment to approval to monitoring and then to offboarding. Now, let's dive into each one of them. Vendor intake. So vendor intake is the first stage. That's step 1. So when a new vendor comes in, I'm asking 3 questions. What are they actually doing for us? That's the first question I ask. The second is, what data can they touch? And the third question is, and how critical are they to our operations? So those 3 answers set the tone for everything that follows. So take note, this is the first stage of the life cycle, the vendor intake. Now we move on to the second stage. That's the due diligence. So once I have these answers, I tier the vendor. So what I mean by tier the vendor is I break them down into risk tiers. So the low risk gets a light touch review. Normally, low risk vendors do not have any heavy review other than the initial review. Then I move to the medium. So the medium gets a standard questionnaire. So we have a standard questionnaire. Those who are familiar with SIG, Light, and SIG Core, and other security due diligence questionnaire. So the medium gets a standard questionnaire. And then the high risk gets a full due diligence. And critical vendors, these are the most critical vendors in your organization. So the ones that are touching core operations and regulated data, right? So these critical vendors get the deepest scrutiny and ongoing monitoring. So the tier decides how much time and effort I put in a vendor risk assessment. Now, for higher tier vendors, this is where the evidence I'm asking for comes in, right? So questionnaires to start with, the initial stage, then you request for sub 2 type 2 reports if your framework allows it, if your third-party risk management program allows it, and then you move to ISO 27001 certification. So certain organizations have a primary certification to request, like the SOC 2 Type 2 report. If the vendor doesn't have a SOC 2 Type 2 report, the secondary is ISO 27001 certification, including statement of applicability. And then there's also the penetration test results. And depending on the vendor, you request for either the SIG or the CAIQ responses, right? So the CAIQ is the cloud specific questionnaire that is aligned to the Cloud Security Alliance framework, which is why I asked for more than one. So based on your organization's third-party risk management program, you can request for any of these certification depending on the criticality of the vendor you are trying to onboard. Now, here is something I really want to stress on. Collecting this document isn't the job. Now, reading them is the real deal. So a SOC 2 report only tells you what was true during the audit window, not today. So there's an audit window where the vendor performed that external assessment. So it's a window, normally a 1-year window, dependent. So the exception sections is where the real gaps lives. So I've reviewed and analyzed couple, hundreds of SOC 2 type 2 reports. Some are 100 pages, 90 pages, 120 pages. That is the real deal. Now, the exception section is where all the gaps lives, right? So that's where to start. Now, many organizations are moving to automation. Many organizations are using GRC tools or third-party risk management tools like OneTrust, Vanta, Drata, Scorecard, PitSite. It's a lot. So some of these GRC tools or third-party risk management tools have the capability to analyze a SOC 2 report, but I have been in a position where I had to analyze a SOC 2 report manually, looking at over 100 pages. You see how difficult and how time consuming it is, right? So once you move to the exception section, that is where all these gaps lives, right? And you match how deep you go to the vendor tier, right? So you don't spend the same energy on every vendor. Depending on the criticality of that particular vendor, that is where you spend much of your energy. So let's make this concrete. I want to walk you through a case study. It's a fictional case study, but it's built on the kind of situation I run into regularly. So meet Cloud Pay Analytics. So Cloud Pay Analytics is a payment processing vendor, right? So accessing Cloud Pay tells us what we are dealing with, right? So they process payment data on behalf of our customer, which puts them in a high risk tier right away. Given what they touch, I requested a SOC 2 Type 2 report and their most recent penetration test report. That's the evidence I need before I can sign off on them. And here's what I found. CloudPay's SOC 2 report shows multi-factor authentication MFA is optional for their internal admin accounts. And to me, that's not a small thing. The system touches our payment data directly, and their risk tier tells me how much time I can give them to fix it. So I documented the gap, notified them, and set a remediation deadline. When you find something like this, you've got four options. You either mitigate it, that is, have them fix it on a timeline, avoid it, that means walk away if it's too much, you transfer it, that means shift the financial exposure through an insurance or contract terms, or the last one is to accept it. If it's low enough and there's no better path, for CloudPay, we went with mitigate. So getting a vendor approved isn't the finish line. After approval, I'm still tracking their posture continuously. So not just onboarding, right? I reassess on a schedule or after major changes. Update contract terms when their risk profile shifts, and make sure I know exactly how they will notify me if something goes wrong. So approval is not the end stage of every TPRM lifecycle. As I mentioned, you go through continuous monitoring, reassessment, contract changes, and also incident response. So these are some of the things that you look out for once a vendor is approved. So a few mistakes I see programs make over and over with my experience in GRC and third-party risk management. So many professionals treat every vendor the same, right, regardless of the risk, and that is a very big mistake. Now, collecting evidence once and never revisiting it is also a mistake. Letting procurement sign contracts before security even reviews the vendor is also a mistake. And skipping offboarding so access stays open long after the contract ends is also a mistake. So these are some of the few mistakes I see third-party risk management professionals make. They treat every vendor the same. There's no criticality, there's no risk steering. And once some of the professionals collect evidences once, they never look at it again, right? You have to be constantly reviewing these artifacts and these documents. And I see so many people let procurement sign off on a contract before a security review. Now, mind you, if you're lucky enough and there's no breach or there's no incident on the vendor side, you'll be lucky. But you are not guaranteed that there wouldn't be any breach or any incident on the side of the vendor. And one of the risk and mistakes that people do shy away from is offboarding. So I've come into contact where so many vendors have been, there's no contract with the vendor and the organization, but once you go into the system, you realize these vendors are still sitting in the system. And mind you, if the external vendors, if they have access to your system, they can penetrate into your system, break into your system, and do whatever they want to do. So these four mistakes, we have to try as much as possible to avoid these common third-party risk management mistakes. Now, if you take away four things from today, let it be all this. Third party is your risk. A repeatable life cycle beats ad hoc reviews every time. And make sure you analyze evidence, don't just collect it. And monitoring after approval matters just as much as the assessment itself. So these are some of the key takeaways from this presentation. You make sure you treat every third-party risk as your risk. A repeatable life cycle beats any ad hoc reviews every time. So you make sure your life cycle is alive. Your life cycle is not sitting down dormant without performing any reviews. And make sure you analyze evidence. Once you collect an evidence, make sure you analyze it. Like I mentioned, if you find yourself in an organization where you don't have any GRC tool, any third-party risk management tool, you have to review the documentation manually, and that takes time. Now organizations are, onboarding GRC automation tools, third-party risk management automation tools to review some of these documents. So this is time constraint, right? Once the organizations onboard these third-party risk management tools, it speeds up the review process, or it speeds up the third-party risk management life cycle. And as much we are able to approve vendors on time, there is no delay as to a vendor has been sitting in the time or in the queue for 2 months or 3 months. So for me, the fastest I've been able to approve a vendor when it's a low risk is like 2 to 3 days, as long as they provide all the relevant and necessary information I need. Because a low risk vendor doesn't touch your organization's systems or data. And just as briefly as this presentation, this is the case study that I brought, and I hope you'll be able to learn how to build a third-party risk management framework from scratch. I'm looking at whatever we've gone through, and that's what I've got for you today. I would love to hear what's on your mind. So drop your questions in the chat and let's talk through them. Any questions, you can bring it on board. Questions? So we have our first question. This one says, for an organization building a third-party risk management program from scratch, what are the first three actions it should prioritize to achieve quick results without overwhelming resources? So this is a very good question. And I would say this is so for let me take it this way. So for an organization, building a third-party risk management from scratch, I'll prioritize three actions, right? The first actions I'll prioritize is to build a vendor inventory and establish ownership. So this is one of the things I've um, encountered in many of my GRC or third-party risk management roles, right? So there's no vendor inventory, right? And there's no clear ownership. So what you have to do is to start by identifying your third parties, all the vendors that you have in your organization. You start by identifying all the third parties, what service they provide, what data they handle, and who owns each relationship internally. So you cannot manage risk you do not know exist, right? And the second is to introduce a simple risk tiering. So do not assess every vendor the same way. You need to classify vendors as low, medium, high, or critical based on factors such as sensitive data, system access, business criticality, and regulatory impact. So all this allows limited resources to really focus on the vendors that create this, the most risk. And the third part is you need to establish a basic assessment and decision process. So you don't need to, you know, stress yourself or give pressure to your process, and make sure you establish a basic assessment and decision process. So what I mean by that is, for example, for a higher risk vendor, you define what you will review, such as a security questionnaire, a SOC 232 report, ISO 27001 certification, penetration test results, or other relevant evidences, right? So then you document all these findings and remediation requirements. You also take into consideration risk acceptance and um, approval decisions, right? So the key, the key is to start. The key is to start very simple. You do not need an expensive GRC platform on day one. I started by doing third party using Microsoft Excel, Google Sheet, right? So a vendor inventory, a clear risk methodology, and a consistent assessment process can give you meaningful results very quickly. As the program matures, you can add automation, continuous monitoring, and metrics as well, right? And we have our second question here. It says, what key performance indicators should management use to measure the effectiveness of a TPRM program? So I believe management should focus on KPIs that show whether the TPRM's program is identifying risk or resolving issues and also keeping vendor risk under control. So if I was the one, I'll focus on these things, right? I'll focus on vendor assessment coverage, right? The percentage of in-scope vendors that completed the required risk assessment. Example, 95% of high-risk vendors assessed, right? So that is one of the KPIs you can, management can use to measure the effectiveness. And then the second KPI management can use is to assessment completion time. So average number of days from vendor intake to the security approval. And this helps management identify any bottleneck that may delay, the business operations. And the third KPI I would say is high risk findings. Now, this is the number of percentage every vendor with high or critical risk findings, right? The trend really matters. So management should know whether exposure is increasing or decreasing. And then another thing I'll look out for is remediation closure rate, right? So percentage of vendor findings that has been, remediated within the agreed time frame. So let's say, for example, 85% of high risk findings close within SLA, right? So depending on your SLA, at least one of the KPIs, the remediation closure aspect. And then I'll also look at overdue findings. So what I mean by overdue findings is the number of unresolved vendor risk that have passed their remediation timeline, right? So this is one of the metrics I would put on an executive dashboard, the number of unresolved vendor risk that have passed their remediation deadline. So this gives leadership a clear view of what to invest in based on the overdue findings. And I'll also look at the reassessment compliance. What I mean by reassessment compliance is the percentage of vendors that has been reassessed, right, according to their required schedule. And then lastly, what I'll look out for, management should look out for KPI is to the vendor risk distribution. You need to show how your vendor population breaks down. If critical, let's say 5%, high risk 15%, medium risk 35%, and low risk 45%. So for executives, I would avoid giving them, 20 different metrics, right? I will build the dashboard around 5 questions. Are we assessing the right vendor? Are high risk increasing or decreasing? Are vendors fixing identified issues? Are assessments and reassessment happening on time? Where do we actually have the greatest third-party exposure, right? So those KPIs give management something they can use to mark risk decisions, right? Instead of simply measuring how many questionnaires the TPRN team completed. So these are um, some of the KPIs management can really look out for to build an effective TPRM program. Any more questions? No problem. Any more questions? Bring in your questions and let's walk through them. So if there's no other questions, then that should be it. Thank you everyone for joining today. And thank you to iExperts for giving me the opportunity to share this session. If there's one thing I want you to take away, it is that third-party risk management does not have to be complicated. Start by knowing your vendors, understand the risk they introduce, focus your assessments based on risk, and continue monitoring those relationships over time. The goal is not to eliminate every third-party risk, but the goal is to understand the risk well enough to make informed decisions. Thank you again. I appreciate your time, and I hope you found this session valuable.